Hello, and my name is Corral Serrano. Though I will be the sole narrator of this presentation, this project was completed with fellow Southern Illinois University School of Law student Joseph Tondini. In our participation in the Healing Illinois initiative, we decided to focus on something that touched many Southern Illinoisans. We wanted to examine the historical connection between race and labor unrest for local coal miners. But before we dive into what occurs when miners strike, we thought it best to provide some contextual information. The presence of coal in Illinois was first discovered in 1673, and mines appeared shortly after. However, the real mining boom didn't occur until around 1830. Naturally, once steam engine technology advanced after the 1860s, the process of finding and digging coal was much easier. Though easier, it did not quell the miners' concerns about the dangerous work conditions. Countless casualties, injuries, and wage disputes resulted in the first mining union, known as the American Miners Association, which was established in West Belleville in 1861. Large industrial workforces were growing in the United States in the late 1800s, and one of the most notable is the Carnegie Steel Company, founded by Andrew Carnegie. Ultimately, it should come as no surprise that a country built upon 246 years of free labor through enslaved Africans would have no foundation on how to humanely treat a growing paid workforce. Because of this, we see the Homestead Strike of 1892, where the workers fought for their right to have an 8-hour workday. Unfortunately, their strike failed once the governor of Pennsylvania brought in the state militia. This tactic continued only 2 years later during the Pullman Strike in Illinois in 1894. Strikers were ultimately defeated by federal troops that were sent by President Cleveland after the Illinois governor refused to deploy state militia. Of course, initially it may appear that, the Illinois governor was against this, but he reportedly sent state militia 9 times to Illinois coal towns to protect mine operators in that same year. It became increasingly clear after this incident that the government took a strong stand against showing concern for strikers' grievances. The previously established American Miners Association eventually morphed with other organizations to form the United Mine Workers of America in 1890. Mining disputes continued throughout Illinois and were marked by tramping strikes, where local UMWA groups would march into other towns and convince the respective towns' miners to stop working and leave. By 1897, various mine owners agreed to contract with the UMWA, which was naturally met with disdain by the largest coal company in Illinois, the Chicago Verdon Coal Company, along with other operators in Pana and Southern Illinois' very own Carterville, Illinois. These strikes continued, naturally, because again, they weren't agreeing to these wages. The mine owners were aware that they could not recruit strikebreakers from the local community because citizens were adamant about supporting their local miners on the strike. Community support for strikes was apparently so strong that a local carpenter in Verdon refused to build a stockade to protect the incoming strikebreakers. The mine owners decided that the best way to end these strikes were to recruit black miners from the southern states as strikebreakers. In their plot to recruit strikebreakers, owners from Pana and Verdon sent recruiters to Alabama. Rather than admitting that their own local miners were not on strike, the recruiters told these black workers that their miners had gone to war. These individuals in Alabama were already dealing with enforcement of Jim Crow laws, which consistently made it impossible for them to escape poverty and prison labor. So many of these men accepted the work and moved their families to Illinois in hopes that they could actually establish a decent living. For Williamson County and Southern Illinois in general, Union support was not as strong. So in addition to strikebreakers from Alabama, black workers were also recruited from Tennessee. Of course, the presence of these black strikebreakers did not go unnoticed, and issues quickly arose in central Illinois, and these issues arose regularly again. As we saw previously, state troops were deployed, but the Union leadership there reportedly was more concerned about advocating peaceful persuasion. Now, what came to a surprise to us in our research was discovering that the UMWA had an official policy of racial inclusivity. So among these striking Union miners were also black Illinoisan miners. Despite this policy of inclusivity, white Union workers did not shy away from expressing their racial hostility. One of the black Union organizers by the name of Richard Davis expressed that there would be no positive outcome if this were to morph into a black and white issue. He said, "I have watched it in the past and have known it to fail. I would advise that we organize against corporate greed." It's absolutely safe to say that his foresight was correct, considering the events that were to come for Southern Illinois. The strikers had success in 1898 in their interception of a train carrying black workers and their accompanying families from Birmingham, Alabama. They managed to convince quite a few black laborers into joining the Union in Verdun. This came at a great price, of course. The passengers were subjected to a shootout between the striking Unionists and the train agents on board. By this time, a new Illinois governor was in power, and he felt it necessary to support laborers' rights, and he declared that miners would be criminally and morally responsible for violence that occurred because of the importation, of strikebreakers into the state. Despite this newfound support in central Illinois, southern Illinois was slow to catch on. Back in Carterville, owner Samuel T. Brush had operated the largest mine with non-union employees during that past year. Taking advantage of the non-union strikebreakers that left central Illinois, Brush made plans for these workers to join his mine in retaliation for the UMWA recruiting black Carterville residents. On June 30th, Union recruits decided to thwart Brush's plans by attacking the incoming train. Shots rang out, and one of the wives of the black strikebreakers aboard was struck and died. 20 others aboard the train were also injured. Any attempts to depart the train were stopped, and the violence continued. From July to September 11th, troops sent in by Governor Tanner occupied the area. And no less than a week later, after the troops' departure, 5 more deaths occurred. These non-union black strikebreakers continued to play an integral role in Samuel Brush's mines, even though the power of the UMWA in other parts of the state increased. It wasn't until 1906 that Brush eventually sold his mine to the Madison Coal Company, which vowed to only employ union miners. The 9 strikers that were responsible for the initial shootout were later completely acquitted. Aside from the turmoil in southern Illinois, the mine strikes seemed promising for change, but the increased Union strength was not the only outcome. The racial divides persisted. The city of Verdun and Pana became sundown towns after their Union strikes. A year prior to the strike and riot at the Carterville train station, Samuel T. Brush had already established a small black settlement known as Dumaine. The nearby majority black settlement of Culp also emerged in 1901 by owner John Culp, who also later sold to the Madison Coal Company in 1906. Hence the alternative town name Culp No. 9, because it eventually became the 9th mine of the company. More strikes and deaths resulted in later years in this area, and they also went unpunished. White miners had even cited to voice their disdain by referring to these general areas as Inward 9. It is unclear whether the contribution of these black miners was appreciated or if they're largely regarded as burdens or obstacles for the Union miners in their battle for rights. Regardless of this, though, the black residents in these areas were determined to thrive with what they had, and they had built their own businesses. They had a barber shop, a post office, stores, churches, and schools. For today, Dumaine is largely uninhabited, but there is a still small community in Culp. Both areas, nevertheless, are packed with a rich history and have fostered the minds of many great Illinoisans. One of those, for example, is Dr. Andrew Springs. He settled in Dumaine in 1908 with his wife, who was also a physician. Together, they created a small hospital and they also opened a clinic. In the middle here, you can also see a picture of his general office. Dr. Springs hosted first aid meetings with miners, and again, as you can see in this picture, these miners were not only black or colored miners, these were also white miners. And they hosted these meetings every Friday with their families of the miners and the miners themselves. His studies on miners' health would go on to be published in the Journal of the National Medical Association. He eventually became the official doctor for the Madison Coal Company in 1915 after participating in a recovery mission due to the Royalton mine explosion. He later established one of the first black Boy Scout troops, which you can see pictured on the right, with whom he'd love to share his native heritage with. Another great Illinoisan is Miss Helen Bass Williams, who was born in Dumaine in 1916. She was a lot of things. She was an educator and an activist who went from being a principal in Dumaine Elementary, the first black professor at Purdue University, teaching French, social studies, health, and then she went on to help develop Head Start programs in Mississippi. She protested alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Septima Clark, Rosa Parks, just to name a few people. She participated in the freedom rides for the black vote in Mississippi, and she did all of this and much more only to come back to Southern Illinois and continue educating and mentoring those in her community until her passing in 1991. Both her and Dr. Springs have accomplished so much throughout their lives that it's truly a disservice to even attempt to condense their stories into a single slide. Overall, this process revealed to us that history does really repeat itself. Though it may not appear as obvious at first glance, dispute about migrant workers, immigration, remote work, and the minimum wage strongly echo what we learned about in the early history of Illinois mining strikes. The working class in the United States are not in agreement with one another currently, and at times it certainly seems like we're doing what the black union miner Richard Davis, that I quoted early, said not to do, which is neglecting to properly organize against corporate greed, rather than allowing our employment issues to become a black and white thing or even an internal struggle. Of course, our employment battles today are much more complicated than strikes and racial disparity. The battles that we even have today are not limited to employment. Even today, for instance, there are people who genuinely believe that CULP stood for an abbreviation for colored people. So ultimately, our hope is that Illinois residents, particularly Southern Illinois residents, will take the time to further explore the history of the area's mining routes and the areas that subsequently developed, so that they can grow to understand that the black strikebreakers and their descendants were and are still not the enemy. Considering that the events of the Civil War were still fresh, we have to consider how those black Southern strikebreakers were going to be highly skeptical about joining a union alongside white miners in an area of the United States that was completely foreign to them. Again, ultimately, we hope in this project is that you consider whether your family was a miner, a farmer, or had immigrated sooner rather than later, or were even unfortunately brutally forced into this country. The true sense of independence and financial stability is what we ultimately crave when it comes to taking care of our families. And the manner in which we do that may not seem correct to another person. And with that, I would like to say thank you for viewing and listening to our presentation. My partner, Joseph Tondini, and I would like to thank SIU law professors Sheila Simon, Doug Lind, and Nolan Wright for their constant support. We would also like to thank the Williamson County Historical Society for the great resources. Thank you.